to tell you all this. I spent the last 2 weeks worrying about this talk. I did very little else. My house looks like a disaster area. Computers weren't sufficient to put this talk together. I had Post-it notes everywhere and books open everywhere, and as of yesterday, I had this gorgeously choreographed talk with quotes and a speech all written out. And at 11 o'clock last night, I canned the whole thing. You don't deserve a choreographed, written out, read speech. You deserve me to be right here talking to you as personally as I possibly can, and that's really the only way I can do it. So we'll see what happens with these slides I've got. So as you can see from this year's heroine, we are all surfing the tidal wave of change that you hear about in the papers and read about in all the trade rags and the popular press. And it's a very, very exciting time. We are all riding that wave with all of our colleagues. But this is a potentially dangerous tidal wave. This is not necessarily something that is going to do the world tremendous amounts of good. And the promise of computing is really tremendous for everybody. But the question what we have to ask ourselves is, if we aren't able to make this work for everybody, is it really worth it all? Is it really worth all this change? We hear these great stories about the kinds of things that are going to happen in the future. We're going to wear networks of computers on our bodies. That's an interesting one. We're going to, what was the one I heard recently? Oh, our umbrella is going to be hooked up to the internet, and it's going to hop out of the closet at us as we leave in the morning and say, "Take me with you." We're going to be able to, when we're off at these wonderful conferences, we're going to be able to send virtual snuggles to our friends back home. Maybe that's what those body networks are for. But somehow I think the potential is considerably greater than this, and it's pretty clear that those kinds of things are probably only going to be available, at least in the long run, for a very elite few. We have a society right now that is considerably too stratified, and this tidal wave and all the fabulous things that are going to happen may only positively impact a fairly small portion of the world's population. And unfortunately, women are frequently of that part of the population that don't get these tremendous benefits. Many people have asked this question, the question of access and what it's for. We see in the paper again all the time, and the president and all sorts of other people are talking about wiring up the schools and wiring up the libraries and sticking kiosks out in supermarkets so that we can have access to this world of information. And plugging in is fine, access is fine, but there's a bigger question out there, and that is, what is the access to? How are we going to use it? Access without the knowledge to use what's behind it is no access at all. And access to things that have been designed without you in mind, that are not relevant to your life, is no access at all. The knowledge economy has a huge potential. But who is going to participate in that economy? Is it really going to be everybody out there beyond this room, everybody represented by the mixed abilities and mixed genders and mixed races all around the world? It seems to me that until everybody is involved in the design process, in the decision process, until everybody is represented in the lab and in the boardroom, that we will not really fulfill this tremendous potential. So 2 years ago, I challenged the 800 attendees at a very large Women in Science and Engineering conference that the NSF held, to use 50-50 by 2020 as a mantra. And it's my opinion that only by really full participation, only by having a moonshot kind of goal, will we actually do what's necessary to pull women into creating the technology that is going to wash over the world in the future. Now, this seems like a wild long shot, but let's think about how that might happen. I like to think of the process of change that is going to bring us to meet that goal as a spiral. The spiral is one of the most ancient symbols that human beings have ever used, and it represents growth and change. And if we can change the world and our environment a little bit in order to bring more women in, to have more impact on technology, to change the world a little bit more, and we can accelerate that process and think about how we can make that acceleration happen, then maybe we can get to that moonshot goal. So in thinking about this spiral of growth and progress that I would like to see us participate in, I came up with 4 questions that seemed to me that if we could grapple with those questions and get together in a place like this, we might be able to come up with some great answers. So I'd like you to think about these questions all throughout this conference and talk to each other about them and brainstorm around them. The first most general one is, if you had a magic wand, think out of the box kind of thing, right? If you had a magic wand, how would you transform the relationship between women and technology? Not just you and technology, but women around the world, all sorts of different women in technology. And then think about how the world and how the work environment and all sorts of environments would have to change in order for women to have half of the significant impact on technology. What are the fundamental pieces that have to change as we cruise around that spiral of growth and change? And then the fun part comes. If women really had that much impact, if we could bring everything we really have, all the things that Fran talked about, into the lab as we design the stuff that we're designing, as we have meetings to decide what things we're even going to bother to design, how would the technology change? Give yourself the freedom to ask that question. We don't often, in the places we work, have the question, the freedom and the permission to actually ask that question. And then as we work our way around the spiral, if women had that much impact on technology and we applied it and we built the stuff that we wanted to build in the way we wanted to build it, how would the world be different? How would that tidal wave look different if we were shaping it? And until we open up our minds and think about what that means and give ourselves the freedom to do that, we won't really be able to start the process of creating that new technology. So I asked these questions on Sisters last week, and I hope those of you who are here who I'm going to quote now won't be too upset with me. What the answers did for me, the many, many answers and many wild ideas, just off the cuff, in the first 5 minutes people responded quickly. What they did was point out what the real, just the surface of the potential of thinking about these questions is. The potential is saner workplaces, an easier integration of work and personal life than has been possible since the Industrial Revolution pulled us away from home and into the factory. The potential is universal education. They're great, aren't they? Universal education and easy access to useful, relevant information that can improve the health and welfare of every person on the planet. That's the potential we have. The potential is safety and privacy, not the reverse. The potential is access to people and information without travel and without the disruption of communities and families that is so common right now. And the potential is new connections and new virtual communities. The potential is sustainability and enrichment without the destruction of the earth. So now we know what the potential is, right? How the heck do we get there? Well, we got a hint about how to do that at the last Grace Hopper celebration. And never being one to shy away from that kind of challenge, I have an idea. Sisters was a start. Grace Hopper celebration is a start. These are places where we can give voice to the answers to these questions, where we can talk about it and get our ideas out and floating around. But there aren't very many really good places to put those ideas into practice and try them out. We almost universally work in places where we are the minority, where even if we have really sympathetic colleagues, and I'm sure that many of you do, it's very, very difficult to immerse ourselves in thinking about technology from a female perspective for the benefit of women of the world. Where do you go do that? Well, how about the Institute for Women and Technology? I am currently in the process of trying to create this, and with your help, in the coming years, the Institute for Women and Technology will try to accelerate the pace of that growth and change spiral. My current idea is that we will bridge the span of research and paying a lot of attention to all the social research and technical research that's going on out there, but primarily be a development organization that builds things as the result of input from women's communities, so that we are no longer taking stuff that was not designed with us in mind and shoehorning it into our communities and saying, this is good for you, figure out how to use it. But we will try to build things with women in mind and see what happens. Being an eternal optimist, I think some really great things are going to happen. And I think that doing this and providing a place to do this and a place for people to come and visit and immerse themselves in what that process is like is going to attract more women to computing and attract more women to technology and all the sciences. And I think it's going to change the world because we're going to try and deploy that stuff out into communities. What we are really going to try to do is figure out what happens when we change the rules. When we change the rules of the game to the ones that we want to play by. See what happens. I really believe that that rather than coming up with a different technology, that we will enrich what we've got so that it's good for a much, much broader portion of the population. So, skeptical people have said, well, what does that mean? Give me a concrete example of how the technology might be different. Well, you really have to look at things differently, right? You have to look at it through different eyes, with different tools. And the example that I have come up with that I think is fun, that some of you have heard, is that of the kiosk that everybody's talking about. We're going to put a kiosk out there, and people are going to have access to all this fabulous information. Well, if you look at some of the research around how particularly girls and boys are interested in using computers, kiosks that present a model of one person, one computer, getting information, very focused on this one person, is a very male model. Girls like to cluster around a machine. So what happens if instead of thinking of a kiosk as something that is an expert that provides information to one person at a time, you think of a kiosk as a participant in a small group discussion? I claim that the kiosk changes from the bottom up. The hardware changes, the interface changes, the input and output devices change. I asked sisters this question, and some of the ideas were really marvelous. First of all, and I'm afraid I don't have the attribution for all of these things, but many of them were common to the messages that I got. The first one was, start by breaking the one mouse, one keyboard paradigm. In other words, you don't network, you don't get a bunch of girls to talk to each other you don't put them in a room each with a computer and network the computers for them to talk to each other. You give them a big screen and a bunch of different input devices and let them talk personally and use what's on that screen. You could start with multiple microphones and eventually go to voice recognition that could tell which participant in the discussion was talking. Hey, that's a big challenge. And there are people looking at all of these, but are they looking at it for quite this reason? I don't know. One big screen on the wall was another one that came up many times instead of trying to cram around a little one. Multiple virtual reality gloves. And what this led to is one of the best messages that I got. Whoever thought of it from that perspective? I love this one. It's just fabulous. So the other question I asked was about wearable computers. And I had to think about a question that was asked by Norbert Hill, who's a Native American and head of ACES, at a meeting of a group called Access by Design, which is bringing together all sorts of different underrepresented folks to think about the design of technology. And there was a very funny talk given that I didn't attend, heard about secondhand, so I won't quote any individuals directly, but it was about the possibility of how you power some sort of wearable device. And they're thinking about, I think the thought was that you might use people's breathing, right? Somehow use people's breathing to power it. But they weren't quite sure what piece of clothing you'd attach it to grab breathing. We could have figured that one out in a minute. They want us to wear stuff around our waist. Why can't they wear stuff around their chest? I don't know. Anyway. The other thing that I'd really like, I know that all this fashion stuff is terribly frivolous, but you know those big headset things? Well, I want mine to look like a 1930s hat. I want nice earrings for the input for my speaker device. I want a pretty veil, right? I want one of those nice little black veils so I can see my virtual reality stuff. This would be cool. And believe me, I'll bet there's a real technical challenge in making that one work. Now, to be a little bit more serious, there are some tremendous technical challenges from looking at women's communities all over the world, not just those of us who can afford fancy hats. If you take a look at, and I recommend that you take a look at two very important documents on the web. One is the set of platforms that came out of the Beijing Women's Conference. And one is the United Nations Human Rights document, which, by the way, is under challenge at the moment. And I think we should all be very well aware of that and do whatever we can to make sure that the rights that we have under that document, even though they haven't been implemented, are still the rights that the world demands for us. Suppose that one of the technical challenges that we came up with was to provide some sort of a device to women in places where the women's communities are disconnected from all three of the power networks that make all this stuff work. The first one is the political power network. The second one is the electric network. And the third one is the telecommunications network. If you're trying to help women in developing countries to improve their situation with respect to equity and to have technology do this somehow and to leapfrog development stages, then you have to figure out what the thing is that you give them that is durable and connected and reliable and is useful. And that is a huge challenge. A huge challenge. Who knows what we could come up with if we focus on the kinds of situations that women are in? Gender or no gender, the situations that women around the world are in are a tremendous challenge to us. This is really, really hard work. But I cannot think of anything that I could spend the rest of my life engaged in that would be more exciting and would have more potential to make a tremendous impact. And I can think of no challenge that would draw young women into this field greater than knowing that what they're doing is not sitting in a lab doing stuff that is disconnected from the world. They're sitting in a lab doing something that is very, very connected, and they can bring their whole selves to it, their full sense of what the world is, the intuition that we're so famous for, and that it's okay to do that. You don't have to put that in the closet anymore. Keep that at home anymore. I hope you all go out of here struggling for progress and not worrying about getting permission. You get your own permission from inside, and it's the right thing to do. Now, I actually have more time. One of the things I did when I tossed the talk, I know this might not look like I tossed it, but it was a way different talk at 11 o'clock last night. I'm not going to talk anymore. I think we have, I don't know, another 10 or 15 minutes. And I hope that you have some ideas that you're willing to come up to these mics and share. Some thoughts about what this institute might be. Oh, let me mention one more thing. It is very likely that very soon I will have some concrete announcements to make about the institute. I'm working with some organizations right now. I hope that this becomes a place where corporations and foundations and the governments of the world are all interested in participating and are all interested in making it happen. If you have any contacts that you can help me with, I would be delighted, but I believe I have a start, and you all will hear about it as soon as it's in writing. So anyway, I would be delighted to have you come up to the mics and add whatever you have to add and ask me questions for the next few minutes. I really would like you to join in on this process. Barbara.
I'm Barbara Simons, and I chair the U.S. Public Policy Committee of ACM, which is otherwise known as USACM. First, I want to thank Anita for all the work she's done. I know one usually gives thanks at the end of a meeting, but since I live in the same town as Anita, I know she's been working really hard on this, and I'd like to thank her at the beginning as well. Secondly, I want to talk about an issue which I feel has tremendous implications for us as women, as computer scientists, and as citizens. I don't know how many of you have been following the crypto issue in Washington, but there is actually an amendment before legislation right now, which is scheduled to be voted on September 25th. It's called the Oxley-Manton Amendment, which, if it passes, will put significant restrictions on domestic use of encryption in this country. In particular, it will forbid the use of any device or any software that does not make plain text immediately available upon request by law enforcement. This is before Congress. It has a good chance of passing. The battle for crypto in Washington has done a 180-degree turnaround. We thought we had a bill called the Goodlatte Bill, which, had it passed, would have loosened export controls on crypto and forbidden any domestic controls on crypto. It also has a provision which I don't think is very good, use crypto, go to jail provision, but it still by and large would have been an improvement over the current situation. That will be a complete turnaround if this passes. This is very serious. USACM is trying to get a letter signed by a large number of scientific and engineering societies in this country. The computer science society, the ones that are not computer societies, haven't even heard of it. They don't even know. They don't understand why it should impact them. It's a struggle. We have to educate them in the course of trying to get this letter signed. That's how serious it is, and the lay public just don't have a clue. So if you're at all concerned about this, I urge you to contact your Congress people immediately. I mean, this is next week we're talking about. Phone them.
Yeah.
Don't send email.
Barbara talked to me about this earlier, and I encouraged her to get up and tell us a little bit about this, because it's certainly relevant only to the people in the U.S. at the moment. But I mentioned this issue that the future holds, privacy and safety, and this is a real problem that we ought to be paying a lot of attention to.
I mean, just to point out the absurdity, if you encrypted a message and stuck it in an envelope and put it in the mail, it would be legal. But under this legislation, if you sent the same message on the net, it would be illegal if you used strong encryption. Yeah. The bill number 695.
695?
695, it's what's known as the SAFE bill. The amendment is the Oxley-Manton, O-X-L-E-Y. Oxley's from Ohio. I'm not sure where Manton's from. Do you know? The Oxley-Manton amendment. It has to be defeated. It's really, really bad. I should say, right. Industry is fighting this. We're not the only ones. I mean, all of the IT industry is united in opposition. In fact, someone who's working on that said to me, he told someone in the White House for the first time they've gotten them all united. Great. Because they're all opposed.
I think that if you have questions, please see Barbara.
Please do, yes.
Okay. Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria Clave from the University of British Columbia, and I also want to thank Anita and give her a big hug when I can get close enough to her. Anita loves to be hugged, in case you hadn't figured this out, so feel free, guys. I wanted to just, first of all, I want to really affirm what Anita has said about the need for us to feel free to use our knowledge and our talent with technology to change the world. And change the world not just in the United States and in Canada, but around the world. And I just very quickly wanted to tell you about a wonderful experience I had about 10 days ago. I was asked to give a day's worth of talks to about 25 women who are the presidents of women's colleges in China. Now, China has at least one women's college in every province, and only one of these women spoke any English. And so the day went sort of, I said a sentence and it was translated, and then there was sort of going on in the room as they mumbled about it. And the topic of my day was essentially gender issues in computing. And these women had flown in essentially 36 hours before, and they were jet lagged, to put it mildly. It's a long trip. And as I started talking about gender issues, they start to fall asleep. And, well, I mean, for those of you who teach, you know what you're supposed to do is that you ask them a question, so they have to do something. So I asked the question of, were there any gender differences in their computer science courses in terms of, you know, who was teaching them? Seeing their women's colleges, clearly the enrollment is all women, but in their sense, if they look as they're across China, how about the representation of women in science and technology, particularly information technology? And so this was translated, and one person started to reply, and then another person started arguing with him, and all of a sudden the room was just well, this was the most amazing day I think I've spent in a long time, because it was really clear that this group of women had never really felt empowered to discuss this issue among themselves. And by the end of the day, they were saying, I was getting asked questions like, well, is there any genetic difference between women and men in terms of their ability to do mathematics and computer science? Do you really believe that women can do technically hard things? At the beginning of the day, they thought there was no difference for women and men in terms of their opportunities in China. By the time they were halfway through the day, they were convinced that there was injustice in their country, and by the time they got to the end of the day, they were writing down things they could do when they got home. So I just cannot overemphasize how important it is for you to be willing to raise these issues. I mean, you might be, and I certainly have had times in my life when all I really wanted to do was think about a very narrow technical issue. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But if it ever crosses your mind that you want to change the world,
just do it.
Do it.
Thank you, Maria. By the way, Maria was the chair of computer science at the University of British Columbia. She's currently vice president at the university and has just received a very cherished NSERC chair for women in science and engineering. So she's going to be out there changing the world with us. Let's see, Judy.
Hi, Anita. Thanks very much. I wanted to make 5 points. You talked earlier about a little bit about out-of-the-box thinking and how we're going to impact the world. 50% of, we're going to take over 50% of the control of the world and hopefully control of the wealth of the world by 2020. Okay, a pretty admirable goal. And one of the ways we're doing this is to think about the long-term impacts of some of the things, some of the laws that are being passed. Back immediately to what Barbara was saying about encryption, this seems like such a technological issue to some of us that it seems in another box that we can't wrap our heads around. So I wanted to make 5 points on why this is an issue for you. The right to cryptography is part of the right to control over one's own body and personal property, in particular the control over the manner in which one communicates. The right to cryptography is part of the right of people to speak freely without chilling effect of unknown monitors. The act of encryption removes speech from the public sphere. All encrypted speech is necessarily private speech. This also should include your medical records as being a way to keep your medical records from the law enforcement community. The right to cryptography is part of the right to peaceable assembly online, by which a group may talk freely amongst itself, including women's groups, without fear of surreptitious eavesdropping. The right to cryptography is part of the right to self-determination and internal debate unhindered by agents of totalitarian governments. The right to cryptography is part of the right to travel, for it is by enciphered communication that a person can remotely enter distant virtual realms unencumbered by having to present one's government papers. This makes cryptography a human rights issue, and I think it's really important to follow our laws most immediately and the laws of all the countries around the world, because it's only through unhindered speech that we'll be able to make ourselves clear and known and powerful.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Mary Lou.
Yes, I'm Mary Lou Sofa from the University of Pittsburgh, and I think your institute sounds very exciting. But there's one aspect that I want to encourage you to think about. I was fortunate enough to spend a semester as a faculty member on the semester at sea voyage, and we visited many developing countries. What I gathered from that trip, and it's remained with me, is that women in a lot of the developing countries can already be helped with the technology that we have. They need clean water, they need food, and health care for themselves and their children. We already have a lot of that technology. They just don't have access to it. And so I would certainly encourage you to think about not only developing the technology, but make sure that the people can afford it and that you can, and people can access it, especially women.
That's incredibly important, and this is one of the areas that I'd like the Institute to look at that is one that I don't know a tremendous amount about and is going to take a huge amount of involvement with those communities. The thing that encouraged me about being involved in this was that there seems to be a pull based on stuff that happened at the Beijing conference. And I think pull is the right way for this to happen, not via a push from us. One of the ways I think that we can have an impact is, for example, to build better communication and connection stuff among the organizations that are dealing with exactly the issues that you're talking about, so that the delivery of those technologies is more effective and efficient. But you're absolutely right. We have to be very clear on that.
Hi, I'm Thelma Estern. I'd just like to make the point that there are about 400 departments of women's studies in countries in the United States. And I think before we, or at the same time as we try to do the things that Anita Borg has said, and at the same time as we study technology, we really have to learn a bit about women's studies and where we are. And for those of you who are at universities, there's no connection between women's studies and technology at all. And there are dozens and dozens or hundreds or almost thousands of books on the subject. And I think to really get a good feeling for what Anita's talking about, you should look at some of these books and read them. And if you're at the university, you should try to make some contact and to try to get the women's studies programs there to become interested in technology as something they need, as well as their social studies.
That's a wonderful point. We have one of the things that we really want to do is reach out to all these different communities, and the women's studies community and the women in technology communities have, if not been not communicating, sometimes even have been at odds, and I hope we can change that. I'll take these two questions, and then we're going to have to go on.
Just kind of an observation. My name's Monica Schrafel from the University of Victoria, and I sent around a question several months ago to sisters about how people felt or what experience they'd had with all-women lab sections, which kind of relates to the last speaker talking about the relationship of women's studies to women in computing. And the response I got to that was very interesting, that a lot of women in academia, on the academic side of the sisters list, said this would be really cool, I wish I'd had that opportunity, I had it in some other disciplines, I'd like to see more of it, it hadn't really been happening, but there was a desire to try it. The women from the industry side, interestingly enough, were 50-50. Some thought this would have been really cool in their educations, others said, we have to work with men all the time, so why segregate out students? My personal response is a sense that you'll get that opportunity constantly, so that taking one lab section to have a community is probably not going to mar your ability to work with men in your environments. But that aside, that does speak to this relationship between women's studies and computer science. And that would be a core place in terms of the Institute participating in actually bridging those two sides. And I don't know where the Institute is going to be physically located. I hope it's also a very virtual institute.
Absolutely.
And that it will have satellites.
Absolutely.
And I'd certainly
Yeah.
like to volunteer a couple of shelves from my office to be dedicated to the research center part of the Institute.
Great. Thank you very much. One more.
Hi, my name is Denise Guerrero. I'm chair of ACMW, which is the ACM Committee on Women in Computing. One of the key issues that we're dealing with is encouraging more women to pursue computer science, or could say math and science careers, and retaining women in these fields. And I believe this is important for the empowerment of women in our society, because technology is here to stay, and it's the job market is such that the opportunities in technology-related fields are the high-paying fields in the country right now and around the world. So we need, for that reason alone, we need to bring more women into technology. There's lots of other good reasons to bring women into technology also, which Anita talked about. So I would like to encourage all of us to consider how we can encourage girls to become interested in computer science. And this can start with mentoring, it can be role modeling, it can be the computer games that are out there now. There are a few companies that have just started up in the last few years that are producing games just for girls. And so we need to continue these kinds of trends.
Great. Thanks, Denise. Let's thank Anita. Thank you.